Quentin had always been a curious soul, which is what led him to the old house on Elm Street. The house had stood vacant for years, a relic from a bygone era, and local rumors claimed it was haunted. Quentin didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in mysteries. And this house had plenty of them. It started with the whispers. Faint and indistinct, they seemed to emanate from the very walls of the basement. Quentin first heard them when he was setting up his makeshift workshop. The sound was subtle, a barely perceptible murmur that tickled the edge of his hearing. At first, he dismissed it as the house settling or the wind playing tricks on his mind. But as days turned into weeks, the whispers grew more persistent, almost insistent. One evening, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Quentin descended into the basement with a flashlight and a tape recorder. The basement was a labyrinth of old, forgotten furniture and stacks of dusty boxes. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Quentin moved slowly, methodically, scanning every corner, every crevice. The whispers seemed to dance just beyond the reach of his flashlight, always one step ahead. He set up his recorder on an old workbench and hit play, hoping to capture the sounds. As he listened through the headphones, the whispers became clearer. They were voices, multiple voices, speaking over one another in hushed tones. He could almost make out words, but not quite. It was maddeningly close, but just out of reach. Quentin spent hours in the basement, driven by a need to understand. He listened to the recordings over and over, trying to decipher the voices. He even tried speaking to them, asking questions, hoping for a response. But the whispers remained elusive, always there, but never clear. One night, as he sat in the darkened basement, he heard something different. A single word, clear and distinct, cut through the murmur. Help. Quentin's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't imagining it. The word was real as the cold concrete floor beneath him. He played the recording back, and there it was again. Help. Who was asking for help? And why? The questions gnawed at him. He couldn't ignore them. He had to find out. Over the next few days, Quentin threw himself into researching the history of the house. He scoured old newspapers, archives, and talked to anyone who might know something. What he found was a tangled web of secrets. The house had once belonged to a man named Harold Whittaker, a reclusive figure who was rumored to have been involved in something sinister. There were whispers of disappearances, of people who had gone missing and were never found. Quentin's curiosity now bordered on obsession. He was convinced that the whispers were connected to Whittaker and the dark history of the house. He returned to the basement with renewed determination. This time, he brought tools, determined to uncover whatever secrets were hidden there. He began by removing the old, rotting floorboards. The work was slow and painstaking, but Quentin was patient. Inch by inch, he peeled back the layers of the past. As he worked, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They seemed to guide him, pulling him towards something. Finally, after hours of labor, Quentin uncovered a hidden trapdoor. His heart raced as he pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air that wafted up was musty and damp, and the whispers surged, filling the basement with a cacophony of voices. Quentin hesitated for only a moment before descending into the unknown. The staircase creaked under his weight, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. He reached the bottom and found himself in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, and in the center of the room was a large wooden chest. With trembling hands, Quentin opened the chest. Inside, he found a collection of old journals, photographs, and personal belongings. He picked up one of the journals and began to read. The entries were written in a neat, precise hand, detailing the life of Harold Whittaker. As he read, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Whittaker had been involved in something far darker than Quentin had imagined. There were entries about experiments, about voices and whispers, and about people who had been lured to the house and never left. Quentin's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The whispers were the voices of those who had been trapped here, victims of Whittaker's madness. They were reaching out, begging for release. Suddenly, the whispers rose to a deafening roar. Quentin dropped the journal and covered his ears, but it did little to block out the sound. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the air grew thick and oppressive. In a panic, he fled up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind him. The whispers continued to haunt him, but now they were filled with a sense of urgency, a desperate plea for help. Quentin knew he couldn't ignore the voices. He had to find a way to set them free, to put an end to the house's dark legacy. But how? The answer lay somewhere in Whittaker's journals, in the secrets he had uncovered. As Quentin sat in the dim light of the basement, surrounded by the remnants of the past, he realized that his journey was far from over. The whispers had led him this far, and they would guide him to the end. He just had to listen. Quentin spent the next few days poring over Harold Whittaker's journals. Each entry was a window into the twisted mind of a man consumed by darkness. Whittaker had been obsessed with the idea of communicating with the dead, and his experiments had crossed the line from the scientific to the macabre. The whispers were the voices of the souls he had trapped in his quest for knowledge, people he had lured to the house and imprisoned in the hidden chamber. The final entries in the journal were the most disturbing. Whittaker wrote about his growing paranoia, about how the voices had turned against him. He described a ritual that could release the souls, but the details were vague and cryptic. Quentin felt a sense of urgency. The whispers were growing more desperate, more insistent. One passage caught Quentin's eye. The key lies within the whispering chamber. Only by confronting the past can the voices be freed. It was clear that Quentin had to return to the chamber beneath the basement and complete the ritual. With a heavy heart, Quentin gathered what he needed: candles, chalk, and the journal. He descended into the basement, the whispers guiding him every step of the way. He opened the trapdoor and carefully made his way down the creaking stairs into the whispering chamber. The air was colder than before, and the oppressive sense of dread was almost overwhelming. Quentin arranged the candles in a circle and lit them, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. He opened the journal to the page with the ritual and began to draw the symbols described, his hand shaking as he worked. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging him on. As he completed the final symbol, the voices suddenly fell silent. The abrupt quiet was unnerving, but Quentin pressed on. He began to recite the incantation written in the journal, his voice echoing in the stillness of the chamber. At first, nothing happened. Quentin repeated the incantation, his voice growing more confident. Then, the room began to tremble. The walls seemed to pulse, and the air grew thick with an otherworldly energy. The whispers returned, but now they were unified, a single voice rising from the cacophony. "Free us." Quentin continued the incantation, his voice barely audible over the rising din. The candles flickered wildly, and the room shook as if an earthquake were tearing through the house. Just as Quentin thought he could bear it no longer, there was a sudden, blinding flash of light. When Quentin's vision cleared, the whispering chamber was still. The oppressive weight had lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The voices were gone, their torment ended. Quentin sank to the floor, exhausted but relieved. He left the chamber and returned to the basement, closing the trapdoor behind him. The house felt different now, lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted. Quentin knew that he had done the right thing, that he had given those lost souls the peace they deserved. As he packed up his belongings, ready to leave the house for good, Quentin felt a sense of closure. The mystery had consumed him, but in solving it, he had freed not just the trapped souls, but himself as well. The whispers had guided him, and in the end, they had found their release. Tom had never been particularly close with his father, a stern and solitary man who had passed away suddenly, leaving behind a modest house filled with years of accumulated clutter. Now, Tom found himself alone in his father's basement, sifting through old boxes and dusty furniture, a task he had been dreading. The basement was dimly lit, the single bulb casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls as Tom moved around. He had always found the basement unsettling as a child. Its cold, damp air and the constant hum of the dehumidifier creating a sense of foreboding. Now, as an adult, the feeling hadn't changed. Tom opened an old wooden trunk and found it filled with yellowing papers and faded photographs. Among them, a large envelope caught his eye. It was addressed to his father, but the return address was unfamiliar. He opened it and pulled out a series of typed letters, each one detailing a conversation between his father and someone named Robert. The content of the letters was vague, discussing an event referred to only as the incident. Intrigued, Tom read on, piecing together a disturbing narrative. His father and Robert had been involved in some sort of cover-up involving a missing person. The letters hinted at guilt and fear, but never provided enough details to fully understand what had happened. As he read, Tom's unease grew. What had his father been hiding? He decided to take a break and stepped outside for some fresh air. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood. Tom's mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of discovering something terrible. He needed to know more. Returning to the basement, Tom noticed something he hadn't seen before. Behind an old bookshelf, there was a small door. It was almost hidden, blending into the wall. His heart pounded as he approached it. The door was locked, but he found a key hidden in a nearby drawer. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The small room beyond was dark and musty, filled with the smell of decay. Tom's flashlight beam revealed a macabre sight. The skeletal remains of a person, partially covered with an old tarp. He stumbled back, horrified. Who was this person, and why were they hidden here? As Tom's mind raced, he noticed something else in the room. A diary lay on a small table, covered in dust. He picked it up, his hands shaking, and began to read. The diary belonged to Robert, the man mentioned in the letters. The entries were disjointed, filled with paranoia and fear. Robert wrote about the night of the incident, detailing how they had accidentally killed someone and decided to hide the body in the basement. He described his growing anxiety and how he felt the walls closing in on him. Tom's blood ran cold. His father had been living with this secret for years, and now it was his burden to bear. He needed to decide what to do next. Tom sat on the basement floor, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He couldn't stop thinking about the letters and the diary, about the hidden room and the skeletal remains. He needed answers, but he also needed to clear his mind. He decided to start by learning more about Robert. A quick search through his father's old address book revealed Robert's full name, Robert Hastings. Tom found a dusty old phone book and looked up the name. Surprisingly, Robert's address was still listed. Determined to uncover the truth, Tom decided to visit Robert's house the next day. The following morning, Tom drove across town to a dilapidated old house that seemed abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the garden was overgrown. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Undeterred, he tried the door and found it unlocked. The interior of the house was as neglected as the exterior. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners. Tom cautiously made his way through the house, searching for any clues that might help him understand what had happened all those years ago. In a back room, he found a filing cabinet filled with old documents. Most of them were mundane, but tucked away in the back was a folder labeled Incident. Inside, Tom found more letters, photographs, and a newspaper clipping about a young woman who had gone missing in the area around the time of the incident. The woman's name was Sarah Mitchell. According to the article, she had been last seen near the park where Tom's father and Robert often went fishing. The police had searched extensively but found no leads. The case had gone cold, and Sarah was eventually presumed dead. Tom felt a pang of guilt and sorrow. Sarah had been someone's daughter, someone's friend, and now she was just a skeleton in his father's basement. He knew he couldn't keep this secret any longer. He needed to bring closure to Sarah's family and seek justice for what had happened. He gathered all the evidence he had found and went straight to the police station. As he explained everything to the detective, he felt a mixture of fear and relief. Fear of what might happen next, but relief that he was finally doing the right thing. The police took Tom's statement and began their investigation. Days turned into weeks as they pieced together the events of that fateful night. Tom cooperated fully, providing all the letters, the diary, and the documents he had found. It was a long and painful process, but eventually, the truth came to light. Robert Hastings was located and brought in for questioning. Under pressure, he confessed to everything. He and Tom's father had accidentally killed Sarah in a drunken altercation, and in their panic, decided to hide the body. They had lived with the guilt ever since, their friendship deteriorating under the weight of their shared secret. For Tom, the ordeal was far from over. He had to come to terms with the fact that his father was not the man he thought he was. The community was shocked by the revelation, and the Mitchell family finally had some semblance of closure.